One day, one bureaucratic stroke, and suddenly 1,213 cities were no longer called what old maps said they were. Official history calls it administrative tidying, but critics of the record see something else, a mass erasure, executed fast enough to bury memory before anyone could react. Declaim centers on the Russian Empire, where old place names vanished from records and newer labels appeared with suspicious speed. Too fast, some argue, for normal cultural change. And that matters because names are not decorations. Names are anchors. Change them, and entire populations lose the trail back to what stood there before. In the Tartaria narrative, this was the point. Not conquest alone, but controlled forgetting. A way to sever surviving ruins from the civilization they were once linked to. Because once Tobolsk becomes something else, once a fort, a district, a province, all shift labels, the paper trail starts collapsing under its own contradictions. That is how empires clean a crime scene, not by blowing everything up, but by making yesterday impossible to verify. Mainstream scholars reject the Tartaria interpretation entirely. They say maps changed because borders shifted, languages evolved, and empires standardized chaos. That is the official answer. But the number keeps haunting the argument. Not 12 cities, not 50, more than 1,000 allegedly altered in one coordinated administrative moment. If that number is even close to true, then this was not clerical maintenance. It was narrative surgery on a continental scale. And here is where the suspicion deepens. The same century that rewrote names also loved exhibitions, restorations, and convenient stories about who built impossible architecture. Maybe that is coincidence. Or maybe renaming was just one tool in a wider campaign to assign old things new owners, because a renamed city is easier to domesticate. A city with a broken lineage can be folded neatly into a brand new imperial myth. This is the part most people miss. You do not need to destroy every archive if you can scramble the index. And if that happened here, then thousands of later historians may have inherited confusion without realizing they were reading the aftermath of a purge. That possibility changes everything. Suddenly old maps are no longer quaint collectibles, they become witnesses. But witnesses only matter if you compare them. One atlas means little. 10 atlases across decades begin exposing where the official timeline no longer fits. And once you start comparing, patterns emerge. Regions linked to the Tartaria label seem to fracture, shrink, and dissolve into safer, smaller identities, not erased in a blaze. Erased in paperwork, quietly, respectably, permanently. So the real question is not why the names changed. They obviously did. The real question is why they changed in such concentrated, strategic waves. Why this many? Why this fast? And why in territories long associated on older maps with the label they now insist was meaningless. Those questions are where this story actually begins. Not with fantasy, but with paper, names, and a pattern that refuses to sit quietly. In the next part, we start with the documents themselves, decrees, gazetteers, applices, and the exact lists used to track these supposed disappearances. Because if 1,213 cities really were renamed in one day, then someone signed that order, and signatures leave trails. And once we follow those trails, we may find that the vanishing of Tartaria did not begin with ruins. It began with a pen. The trail begins in bureaucratic ink. Not rumor, not legend, but official directories where familiar settlements suddenly appear under unfamiliar names. Researchers chasing this claim usually land on administrative bulletins from the Russian Empire. These were not poetic texts. They were tools for taxation, policing, rail planning, and control. That matters because bureaucracies rename places for reasons. Border disputes, linguistic reforms, imperial standardization, erased minorities, and occasionally, something they do not bother explaining. But here is the disturbing pattern. The lists are broad, fast, and geographically clustered. Entire naming landscapes seem to shift at once, as if someone wanted continuity severed. And continuity is exactly what names preserve. Change a map, and you update paper. Change thousands of names, and you alter memory itself. So what documents are actually cited? Gazettas, census supplements, military maps, provincial registers, and later comparison tables compiled by people who noticed the old names vanishing. This is where the argument gets sharper. The phrase "renamed in one day" may reflect publication date, not the literal moment every local sign changed. That distinction sounds technical, but it changes everything. A single decree can compress years of local transition into one official historical event. Still, the revisionist question remains. Why were so many pre-existing names, especially in older frontier and steppe zones, suddenly judged unsuitable for the new record? Because names are never just labels. They signal who ruled, who traded there, what language dominated, and which earlier world still lingered underneath. And sometimes the earlier world is the real target. Mainstream historians usually explain these shifts through centralization. Empires wanted neat maps, standardized spellings, loyal terminology, and fewer traces of regional ambiguity. And that explanation is not absurd. It fits how modern states behave. The problem is scale, timing, and the stubborn overlap with places older maps link to Tartary. That overlap is the nerve of this story. Not proof by itself, but enough to make the official explanation feel unfinished. Because unfinished explanations are where hidden history usually breathes. Look closer at the wording in these records and another clue appears. Some entries do not describe founding new towns. They simply replace known names. That suggests the settlements already existed in administrative reality. What changed was the vocabulary allowed to describe them, and vocabulary is power. Once a name disappears from school maps, legal notices, and railway timetables, the previous identity stops reproducing itself. This is why the paper trail matters more than legends. Legends can be mocked. A coordinated naming revision in state records cannot be waved away so easily, but caution is necessary too. A suspicious pattern is not the same as final proof. The strongest case comes from matching lists to exact decrees. And once you demand the decree, the story stops being internet folklore. It becomes a hunt for signatures, dates, ministries, and legal authority. And signatures are where states expose themselves. So the next step is obvious. We stop staring at compiled totals and go upstream to the orders that made those totals possible. Because if the renaming campaign was routine, the paperwork will say so. If it was exceptional, the language may betray urgency, secrecy, or coordination. And in the next part, we follow those orders line by line. Because the real question is no longer whether names changed, but who demanded the forgetting. Then the orders finally appear, not as myth, not as screenshots, but as administrative text with dates, stamps, and the cold grammar of state power. And the first thing they reveal is structure. These were not random local adjustments, but centrally formatted directives repeated across provinces and republics. The wording matters. Again and again, the decrees speak of standardization, clarification, correction, and elimination of duplicate or inconvenient place names. That sounds harmless, until you notice the scale. Hundreds upon hundreds, compressed into reporting cycles so tight they imply preparation before public announcement. In plain language, someone had already built the list. The decree was not the beginning of the process. It was the moment the state made it irreversible. And that is the real pivot. Renaming is never just linguistic. It is cartographic surgery performed after political decisions have already been made. One line changes a village name. The next line changes postal routing, tax records, railway tables, school books, military maps, and eventually memory itself. That is how a paper act becomes a historical blackout. The decrees also show hierarchy. Some names were changed locally, but the biggest waves required approval from the highest administrative layers. That alone weakens the comforting idea that this was just spontaneous modernization. Modernization does not usually need synchronized authority across vast territories. It needs a reason, a political reason, a strategic reason, or a narrative reason strong enough to justify rewriting the map at scale. And here, the Tartaria question returns, not as proof, but as pressure. Why were older regional naming layers treated like clutter instead of heritage? Because states usually preserve useful memory. They erase only what competes with the story they need citizens to inherit. And once a place loses its old name, researchers lose a trail. Archives split, census continuity breaks, and local oral history becomes easier to dismiss. That is not theory. It is a mechanical consequence of administrative renaming. Now look at timing. Major renaming pushes cluster around periods of collapse, consolidation, and ideological rebuilding, when states are most aggressive about controlling continuity. That pattern does not prove Tartaria was hidden, but it does prove the map was treated as a battlefield, not a neutral reference tool. And battlefields leave strategy behind. Certain old names disappear faster near routes, frontiers, administrative corridors, and zones important to governance. That suggests utility. Remove the old layer where administration, troop movement, and communication depend on a single obedient vocabulary. But utility can hide motive. A practical explanation and a suppressive explanation can operate at the same time. And that is where serious inquiry begins. Not with slogans, but with comparing every official reason against what actually vanished from the record. Because if the stated reasons were efficiency, the losses should look random. If they cluster around older identity markers, that is a different story. So the investigation widens from decrees to annexes, from annexes to regional lists, from annexes to the names that vanished without explanation. And that is where the clean official story usually starts to fray. The totals are neat, the local realities are not, and in the next section that fraying becomes the point. Because once you compare central decrees to regional execution, the missing names stop looking accidental, then the local records start talking back. Not through speeches, but through mismatched columns where one place survives under 3 different names. A district table says one thing, a postal circular says another. A military list keeps the older form, as if the order never fully landed. That matters because true administrative cleanup should standardize fast. Here the state looks coordinated in proclamations and confused everywhere. Implementation leaves a paper trail. And confusion is useful, because confusion breaks memory before anyone has to openly ban it. Look at the names most likely to disappear first. Frontier labels, steppe labels, older ethnonyms, and names tied to maps that described geography official history now treats as impossible. The official justification usually cites simplification, duplication, easier governance. But simplification does not explain why older regional identities were replaced with bland, safer, centrally legible labels. That is not neutral filing. That is narrative management through geography. And maps are where the pattern sharpens. One atlas preserves an older naming layer. The next edition trims it, regularizes it, then pretends the previous layer never mattered. That editorial narrowing is rarely framed as erasure. It arrives disguised as progress, better cartography, cleaner language, scientific correction. The result is the same. Fewer traces remain visible. Names vanish quietly long before monuments do. Then come school books and gazetteers. Once the new labels settle there, children inherit a map already stripped of older memory anchors. And when later researchers search those books, they often mistake absence for proof. If a name is missing in standardized references, they assume it never had significance. That is the trick. Delete the bridge, then mock anyone who remembers there was once a road. Now add census practice to the picture. Enumerators relied on official templates, and official templates rewarded the newest name, while older local usage drifted into footnotes or nowhere, so the archive begins to self-correct in only one direction. Every new document confirms a replacement, because the replacement has become mandatory vocabulary. This is why one-day renaming is so powerful. It creates a before and after sharp enough for administrators, but blurry enough to confuse everyone living beneath it. And here is the harder question. If this was merely tidy governance, why do the discarded names so often point toward an older civilizational vocabulary many researchers now connect to Tartaria? Not every old name proves a hidden empire, but clusters matter, repetition matters, administrative behavior matters, patterns become evidence when coincidence keeps repeating along the same frontier lines. That is where the sanitized story weakens. It can explain isolated edits. It struggles to explain synchronized identity flattening across huge spaces in one administrative breath, especially when the old labels had already appeared in foreign atlases, trade routes, travel reports, and military surveys that were never supposed to agree by accident. So by this stage, the question is no longer whether renaming happened. The question is, what layer of memory those 1,213 replacements were designed to bury? Because once a name is gone from maps, schools, censuses, and rail timetables, most people stop asking what stood behind it in the first place. But some traces resist: old parish notes, merchant ledgers, early survey sheets. Those fragments do not tell the whole story, yet they refuse the official simplification. And in the next layer of this investigation, those fragments begin to line up with something even more dangerous than renaming: selective survival of evidence. Because changing a name is one act, deciding which records of that older name remain accessible is another. And that is where the cover-up, if real, becomes measurable. Then the fragments begin to align, not into a perfect map, but into a pattern official history keeps pretending is random. The same erased names keep surfacing in unrelated records. Church books, freight lists, land surveys, different scribes, different purposes, same vanished geography. That matters because accidental spelling drift looks messy. What we see here is cleaner, broader, and far more coordinated than ordinary bureaucratic confusion. And that is the real pressure point. A single day renaming only works if the old layer was already marked for removal. Names are not decoration. In old empires, names carried tax rights, trade memory, legal inheritance, and the ghost of who built what first. Erase the name and you do more than relabel a town. You sever continuity between ruins, records, and the people told to forget both. This is why the Tartaria question refuses to die. The evidence is often fragmented, but the pattern of memory removal is disturbingly consistent. Not proof of every claim, but enough to challenge the comfortable story that all these replacements were harmless modernization. Because harmless updates do not usually produce this many synchronized substitutions across such a vast administrative landscape, and they certainly do not arrive at the quiet destruction of the older references that could have verified what came before. That is the part textbooks skip. Renaming is powerful precisely because later generations mistake administrative force for historical truth. Paper can be edited faster than memory, but memory leaves scars in places officials never fully controlled. A margin note, a parish ledger, a freight invoice, tiny survivors, but together they form a countermap beneath the official one, and that countermap suggests something uncomfortable. The renaming campaign may have been less about language and more about ownership of the past. Whoever controls the map controls the ancestor. Whoever controls the ancestor controls the story of civilization itself. So no, the central issue is not whether every renamed settlement was once part of a single hidden empire. The issue is simpler, and in some ways more dangerous. Why was there such urgency to standardize, compress, and overwrite memory at scale? That question points beyond maps. It points towards censuses, archive fires, rebuilt city centers, and impossible timelines around inherited architecture. Because once names changed, other revisions became easier. Population stories, founding dates, builder identities, entire layers could be reassigned without resistance. That may be the real legacy of the 1,213 replacements. Not just lost names, but a rewritten frame for everything attached to them. So when someone says those old names were trivial, remember what had to happen to make them disappear this completely. It took decrees, map revisions, educational repetition, filing systems, and probably the silent disposal of inconvenient records. And even then, the past did not fully cooperate. It kept leaking through ledgers, stones, engravings, and wrong names in the wrong places. Which leads to the next forbidden question. If city names were standardized this aggressively, what else was standardized at the same moment? Because the trail from these 1,013 vanished names does not end on the map. It leads straight into the records of who was counted, who was missing, and why entire populations seem to appear from nowhere.